I can move around, great. Well, thanks so much for taking time out. It's just wonderful to see you all. And really, I view today as an opportunity to have a conversation about something that I know is really important to Anthony. We've had chats about this, and I know it's very important to you. I'm thrilled to be here with my colleague, Ted Hewitt, who's just joined us from Western University, University of Western Ontario, as it used to be known, where he was Vice President of Research and a real ally and supporter and contributor to our work at SSHRC, and it's a thrill for me to have a chance to work with him again in a new role. I want to have a conversation with you today about something that I know is important to many of you, but is key, I think, for all of us, and that is the notion that our universities, higher education in general, is just fundamentally changing. And my emphasis today is on the extent to which we are fundamentally reimagining universities in the tradition that's gone on really since the Middle Ages, at periodic times, reimagining universities for the changing society, the context within which they're attempting to contribute. We'll have some emphasis on the digital age because I think that's the context within which a lot of some deep conceptual changes are being implemented. And I'm going to obviously put an emphasis on the social sciences and humanities in particular. And so my argument today is that, in fact, we are reimagining universities, that the social science and humanities are playing a key role in that, and those deep conceptual changes are being enabled, accelerated, and then influenced by new digital technologies. So it's an argument that I think I would really like your input into and see if we can arrive at some steps forward, because I think at the present time we need to move universities forward in interesting ways. We need some of these changes. I think a lot of the media emphasis and so on is about the economics of it. I know a lot of administrators feel the financial pressures and so on. We're going to step back today and suggest that the reimagining side is really perhaps at the heart of a new way of thinking about some of these problems. So what is reimagining universities? We'll talk today about it in sort of three ways. One is the whole notion of moving from teaching to learning, something that we've seen in many ways in terms of research, a very different way of thinking about how we advance knowledge and build understanding. We've spent a few centuries thinking that that's going to happen mostly through specialization, increasing specialization, and now I think we're learning that it's more complex than that. I like the word contextualization. Some people use the image of the research T, going deep and also broad. And then innovation, how higher education helps make a better world. And we're moving from a pretty simplistic, I think, and singular notion of tech transfer to something that we'll talk about as people-centered innovation and sometimes the expression engaged scholarship. So we'll imagine and think about universities in terms of really deep changes in their classic missions. At the heart of all this is, I think, something that really explains the importance of the social science humanities. And my argument is that we're really only now starting to take seriously the challenge of understanding human beings and the fact that human beings are really at the center of so much of what we think about. Obviously, I'm saying this in juxtaposition to the notion that we live in a technology-driven age, and that changes are the result of technology, and we're sort of get carried along with that, we're responding to it. So the theme of this is really the notion of deep conceptual changes, and they explain why the technologies are so important now and why we're living in, I think, this emerging digital age. So that explains, obviously, why I think the social science humanities have a key role. Because what do? Our focus is on people. We focus on human thought and behavior, better understandings of human beings in the past and present, why we do what we do, and how we can use all that whenever appropriate to try to make a better future. So you can see the broad outlines here. We're going to go very quickly. Alors, bouclez vos ceintures de sécurité. You'll find that in a lot of this, I'll be presenting research that basically suggests that in terms of a broadcast approach, I have about 18 minutes at most before you start thinking about what's for dinner and maybe there's something else that's happening that's more interesting. So I'm in a format that is sort of contradictory to a lot of this message, but hopefully we can get the conversation started. Why do I think that human beings, a focus on people, a new appreciation of that complexity is really at the heart of the deep conceptual changes? My sense is that wherever you look, whether it's in the private sector, public sector, wherever you look, in terms of moving ahead, there's a new approach. In the marketplace, for example, the phrase that we hear a lot now is customer-focused. And you think, well, what's so different about that? And the reality of the matter is the classic approach was to develop a product and then engage some advertisers, and they would convince people out there somehow to buy it. And now there's a whole new way of thinking about the marketplace in terms of customers. The same sort of thing in service industries, all of a sudden getting very interested in who are users, potential users, and so on. New ways to think about collaboration, not just about you pushing out, but also about their interest and how that might relate to you. New expressions about workplaces, about employee and empowered workplaces. And again, this is juxtaposing against a few centuries in which it was top-down. It wasn't about thinking that employees were really running the workplace. It was about the command and control down. We know that that's not there. Similarly, in politics now, every politician who wants to be successful knows about the importance of trying to engage citizens in new ways and thinking about the whole political process in very different ways. We'll talk today about schools as they move from being focused on teachers to focus on students and to focus on learning instead of the teaching side of that. But it's true everywhere. In health, I know that there are a number of researchers here. A big focus now that health is about patients. It's not about the doctors. It's not about the providers. It's about those that are the focus of that. And of course, when you think about it, the human beings are all the same people. The person is a customer as well as being a user and perhaps a patient and student and so on. And how do we connect all that and think about it in really robust ways? And it seems to me that that's really at the heart of a very, very different paradigm. And we're going to focus on schools today in terms of specifically universities. I like to throw this one in just because it gives me a chance to congratulate Anthony for his terrific new book. And if you haven't read Anthony's terrific new book about the origins of a belief in mass schooling, I encourage you to do so, and I know many of you are contributing to our understanding. But basically, let's face it, we all have to admit that for a few centuries we've built school systems that we now know are structured in ways that fly in the face of how people learn. Now, it's kind of a drag for us, I guess, to think about that. You know, it's like, whoops. But I think it's good to recognize. Now, I look out there, and everyone who's ever stood has probably seen that. Hopefully, you haven't seen that. But let's face it. The way we've structured it hasn't been ideal. I'm going to focus on some research drivers of this change and what we think about it. So, you know, when you think about it, research has shown very different ways of connecting the acquiring of knowledge to actually retaining knowledge, differences in terms of knowledge and competencies, for example. A lot of research on that, so it's really, really important. I'm sure here many of you are paying attention to the National Survey of Student Engagement that's become so important in terms of deeper understandings of how learning is connected to motivation, to engaging students. We also have research on creativity that really flies in the face of how universities are structured. The notion, for example, that only at the graduate level and really at the PhD are you going to get creative after you've been disciplined into the established ways of knowing, after you've mastered the existing frontier of knowledge. And we now know, in fact, that creativity is not something that comes after you've learned every reason why things are the way they are. Similarly, the importance of adapting to change, the kind of skills, competencies, and so on related to learning and new ways of thinking about the world. And here, the extent to which digital, in fact, can be an enabler and accelerator, but also an influencer in ways that are sometimes expected and unexpected. So there are many others. This is some of them that really show the extent to which we have really kind of conceptually changed I think, a fundamental aspect of things. The other thing that's a driver of change, though, is our students are different. This is an example that I like from the Globe and Mail, did a survey a couple of years ago, and it asked students, where do you want to work when you finish? And this is a pan-Canadian survey. The data is quite rich. And what I find so interesting is that students in the social science humanities want to work at Apple and Google with greater intensity than those on other parts of the campus. And as you may have expected, the two companies that students most want to work for are Apple and Google. So that's pretty interesting, and why is it that our students are even more prone that way than students elsewhere? And I think it's some clues to the very changing world. So there are other drivers of change, but clearly students today are not students of some years ago. There's a lot of attention now to the implications of that in terms of reinventing undergraduate education, and I know many of you are involved in that here, and I think it's in keeping with some of these strategies. Just a couple that I caught in terms of some of the activities here is the extent to which undergraduate students are now being engaged in research activities. And I think this is just terrific, because it seems to me that the division that we developed, especially during the 20th century, between teaching and research is in fact a very false dichotomy. It never made sense to me to say, well, you know, when students learn something, it's teaching; when profs learn something, it's research. But rather than thinking about it in terms of a much more robust pursuit of knowledge and engagement in that. And student research at the undergraduate level is becoming characteristic. What's happening here at Bishop's is really happening in good programs across Canada and around the world increasingly. And we realize that by engaging students in research activities, their learning in terms of content skyrockets and is retained in really interesting ways. The other thing that's really important is a notion of things like internships or service learning, it's called, and so on, really connecting the academic experience to beyond the campus in different kinds of ways, and getting involved in that larger conversation about trying to understand all aspects of the past and present. I give one example. An historian, for example, Kevin Key, who's at Brock University, he has his undergraduate students developing apps so that they can visit historic sites in the Niagara region. And it's just a wonderful example of combining content, combining the kind of competencies that are really important in terms of lasting learning. Also in Ontario, the HECO report came out with some recommendations in 2010 how to promote learning in the new universities, the reimagined universities, and they all suggest, in fact, that in terms of new profs and graduate students and so on, that we have to take seriously the challenge of learning, of evaluation, of how we think about whether it's small classes, large classes, and so on. And again, as you know, the research on this, small classes are not necessarily better than large classes and so on, and it all depends on the nature of the activities and so on, and some deep changes there that we'll end up talking about. And also in terms of this question of reward and measuring and so on, we're starting to take that seriously as well. One of the things that's expressions that I think is kind of interesting that's popped up in the last year or two is this notion of flipping the classroom and the notion, for example, of using lectures, not for broadcast, but lectures are where people come together in order to engage. And really kind of reversing, flipping the notion of big groups in terms of transmission of knowledge, and rather big groups in terms of engagement and active learning, a very, very different approach. And whereas the broadcast can happen offline and in different kinds of settings. There's also something that's interesting, and it relates to some of the clusters that you've been building here, is the notion of involving student in terms of what in the sciences have been called labs and so on. Or I understand here learning commons approaches and so on, where the notion is very much in terms of imagining the curriculum not in a room per se, in a classroom with seats, but rather in a much more engaging, robust, quote, research-like setting. And this is an example. Kathy Davidson's at Duke, and the Haiti Lab, as they call it, is one of the examples of that. She talks about this in terms of how brain science, in other words, new approaches to how we learn, new ways of thinking about how we learn, is being combined with technology, and is in the process of transforming schools and businesses. And there are many other examples like that. Another kind of dimension of this that Canadians have been at the forefront of, and here's some researchers at UPEI and elsewhere in Canada, and they developed this expression, massive open online courses. You've certainly seen examples in which Stanford, for example, and MIT and so on, and are putting online courses, and you actually sign up, and over the next 10 weeks there are going to be a certain number of lectures and so on, and different kinds of activities, and they're thinking about how this can happen. And it suggests the extent to which there's a real recognition that some of the ways in which we've structured, quote, teaching and learning and service, those three boxes, can really be transcended in different kinds of ways. You won't be surprised that there's a bunch of new efforts along these lines. Coursera, for example, where you can come in and you can learn everything about writing in the sciences, or Greek and Roman mythology. You can do some mathematical thinking and so on. And they have the course, it signs up, you become part of an international community, and they're thinking through ways in which this can really complement some of the activities on campus, as well as reach those who can't necessarily get to campus. Udacity is another one of these efforts now. What I think is really interesting about Udacity, which is kind of a humbling thought as well, as I see my 18 minutes starting to tick away, is the notion that they've increasingly, there's a lot of research now increasingly figured out that when you actually are looking at a body, it's kind of distracting to you in terms of actually learning and engaging. And so they adopt an approach in which you never see a face. And they're playing with that, and it's kind of it's a humbling thought, actually. And I'm not sure how they do that. And I know there's some psychologists in the room, undoubtedly more on top of this research than I am. But I've been really interested in the notion that we've taken for granted a lot, that having a physical person interacting and so on, that's actually a great benefit. There are no downsides to that. And in fact, there's some research that's showing that in fact in certain ways we have to be careful about that. And you only ever see a hand, for example, you see a voice and so on, and they've been playing with that. All of that to say is that I think there's the need for research in terms of really helping advance our sense of all this is really, really important. But what about all those students that want to work for Google and so on? Well, it turns out that this is going to work out pretty well. This is just from, I guess, 18 months ago now, and Google does hire our graduates. There are lots of examples in the Canadian context we'll get to talk about quickly, but clearly what we find is that the interest in the private sector, public sector, for people who have a point of entry and a sensitivity to understanding human thought and behavior, human beings, it turns out are really important. One example is Tom Jenkins, who's a key figure in Canada's largest software company, OpenText, and who is now a council member at SSHRC. And he phrases it like this, and his interest in us is and he's an engineer by background. But he says, in fact, the internet age, the internet economy, the digital age, really was about tool makers to start with, and Canadians certainly were key in that. But he talks about the torch being passed, and the future now belongs to the tool users, the creative people, content providers, service deliverers, and those who have learned how to take the image, sound ideas and share them digitally. And he's picking up on, and his company is obviously thriving on the notion, in fact, that our age is about people and getting that center stage. I want to emphasize to you, I know that there are those stories, you know, first year university student phones home after a few months and says, gee, Mom and Dad, you know what? I've decided to study history. And there's this long pause. But the reassuring thing is that if you look at unemployment by level, and this is data following 2006 census, for example, the punchline is it really doesn't matter what you study. The issue is the nature of the program, the quality of the program, and so on. And I would argue the extent to which the program is really embracing the challenge of reimagining scholarship in our age. And this data is often pretty surprising to people when we point out, in fact. But we can look at it another kind of way. This is some Ontario data along with comparing to Canada, and it basically looks at how much people earn. And again, it's really similar. There's some variations and so on. I'm always intrigued by the fact that the life sciences, when you phone up and you say, gee, you know, I'm going to study something in the life sciences, people assume that that's a bright future, but in fact, it's even a little on the lower side, and we can talk about that. But the punchline, I think, overall is that if you stay in school, you will certainly do better. The other thing that's complicated, though, is in fact, and this I would argue is historically true in many contexts as well, the extent to which the nature of the job market is changing so rapidly and so on, and we get ourselves into lots of false debates about all that. One of the things that we are doing a bit better on is really thinking about career prospects and jobs and so on, and actually helping students engage all that and deal with all that. And I see that there's some efforts here to really make that a lot easier than perhaps it has in the past. Well, what have we done at SSHRC? Well, as you notice, we've been really trying to update ourselves to become a 21st century research council in a robust way. We found, for example, that our program architecture had gotten just too complicated. There were too many overlaps. It was really not as nimble, as flexible as that we wanted to embrace the changing world of research, changing world of scholarship. So we tried to simplify that. We've got down to three main features. One we call this talent side. And we've just last year been doing a consultation, for example, and we're trying to think about this beyond just us giving out scholarships to top graduate students, but also in terms of what their programs look like and so on, and also thinking about what partners might be out there for that, and how are students thriving and so on. Insight, which is up and running, as you know, and we've been thrilled with how those competitions have been going. This question of interdisciplinarity I'm going to come back to, because that's another really interesting aspect of what we're dealing with now. We've also got our Insight Development Grants, and I've been thrilled that we've been able to do a much better job in terms of new scholars. As many of you know, 60% of all profs on campus in Canada today have been hired since the year 2000. Amazing renewal, and I think we have to work very, very hard to make sure that these wonderful new scholars are supported, and I think we've really made a good step forward. This question of interdisciplinarity I want to pause on just a second, because in 2008, as part of a study we did, a question was asked about how researchers defined what they were doing, how they thought about their own research. And this is very robust. I know many of you answered it. We sent this to 22,000 researchers across Canada. Over 6,000 responded, so the responses are really good. So we're going to break this down in terms of whether you think about this as exclusively disciplinary, or all the way to the other side, extremely interdisciplinary. So we have four possibilities, and think about how the percentages are going to go. And then also we divided it between the social sciences and humanities, just to think how that might look. So you got those sort of in your head a bit. We were really surprised, let's be frank. It's become not cool, it turns out, to describe yourself as exclusively disciplinary. Kind of interesting. And in fact, it's pretty cool to call yourself quite interdisciplinary. The other thing that I found really interesting is that social science and humanities is very similar, and they threw in history because I always have to pay special attention to history. And it turns out historians are more or less like other groups. So clearly the way in which we think about our scholarship now, the way in which we think about the vertical, the horizontal, and so on, there's lots of evidence why. We've got people like Steve Jobs, and there's biography that people were reading in the last couple of years. He certainly has a new way of thinking about this. And that notion that there's something magical in those spaces between fields and so on. And this relates back to what I was saying earlier about the research T, about different ways of thinking about that. What does that mean for us? Well, that means that we have to really get away from a siloed approach in terms of the federal research agencies, and we have to think about our work as really intersecting, and these Venn diagrams is a way to capture, I think, some of our efforts, but all of us have a ways to go. So in addition to talent and insight, we have connection, and this is where we're trying to do that horizontal connecting, whether it's on campus, between campus and the larger community, Canada and the world. We're working on that. We're also going to bring out some tools that will help us, and I think that's really important. The other aspect of this that's really underpinning our talent insight connection is this notion of partnerships. And it turns out that there's a big appetite to partner. And this is not surprising. Our CURA program, our Community University Research Alliance program, certainly showed that, but there are other examples, whether the MCRI, other examples of scholars in one area working with scholars in another area, working with partners off campus, other universities, internationally, and so on. And I think there's just lots of interest and appetite, and we've been really interested. And our new program architecture allows us to embrace all this in ways that I think show the great diversity, and there's no simple cookie cutter anymore in terms of how I should actually go back and see if we could. One thing that's really interesting is we find is that our money gets leveraged, and people are able to use the SSHRC grant and go far beyond that in terms of other sources of income. And again, we've broken this down in terms of big grants, little grants. We find that development approach works well. Also, stay tuned. We're going to be revising our whole grants management system. We're aware that there have been some adventures in the past and at other research councils on this, but we really feel that embracing all the new technologies is really at the heart of our ability in terms of this reimagining and this rethinking of what we're doing. We're also taking seriously this challenge of achievement reporting. We feel that we haven't done justice. We haven't told our story in effective ways. We've let out there a lot of misunderstandings, a lot of myths and so on. We really haven't done justice to this. So we're going to try to do a much better job of actually tracking and telling the story of the value of understanding human beings in the past and present. We've also launched an interesting initiative that's been unfolding now in terms of thinking about Canada's future. What can we say in terms of the coming decades and so on? Can we be more helpful on that score? And there's been a number of workshops, as round tables and so on, and if you haven't received a personal invitation, you certainly will. Stay tuned to that, and I think there's been lots at Congress and so on, and again, we're working internationally. And all of this is to say that if we're going to be successful in the 21st century, we can probably contribute. We're pursuing our strategic plan. We're the objectives of our new program architecture. As that continues to unfold, we're really interested in that. We're really interested in this whole notion of connections on campus and beyond, how we might help there. And similarly, that notion of our fields helping make a better world, and I think we all need that. We're doing some special initiatives, are digging into data, for example, with colleagues in the US and Europe and so on. Canadians have been really central in this, the whole notion of all of us in terms of trying to understand the massive corpus that's out there in terms of text now. How do you study 1 million books? How do you take advantage of the social media? How do you understand the data mining aspects and so on. This has attracted a lot of attention internationally. Our humanists, the world of digital humanities, for example, has become so important, and those with they're specialists in medieval script all the way through those looking at social media today have been really central in this. I'm going to close by trying to just summarize quickly why I think the trajectory of our fields is actually quite positive. One is, I think, the clarity of what we're doing. We're all about studying human thought and behavior in the past and present, and I think, as I tried to explain earlier, that's become so important across society. Along the way, we've got to develop better metaphors, new concepts, got to get rid of some of the false dichotomies, but I think we're starting to get there. The other aspect, and I tried to emphasize today, is the economic importance of what we do. Let's face it, we're not part of the problem. In fact, we're part of the solution, and there are many ways to think about that. Similarly, I think, as I suggested, we're taking seriously the challenge of measurement and evaluation. We didn't take that seriously. I think it hurt us. You know, our reaction was often, oh, well, what we do is really complex, or you shouldn't be asking us. And in fact, our whole scholarly culture is based on it. We call it grading, and we certainly reduce months of work with students to one letter in many cases. So I think we're doing a much better job, and we're redefining excellence. We have a long way to go, but I think we're starting to get there. Similarly, these connections across campus, I was suggesting some of the really interesting areas, medical humanities and the world of genomics, for example, environment, on and on. We're making contributions really across campus and beyond in terms of engaged scholarship, which I think is so important. We're certainly embracing, and I would say leading, the digital age. Our image, text, sound technology program, digging into data, all the data, text mining, all of it circles back to our fields and the kind of expertise that we've developed. And along the way, I do think we're renewing, we're reinventing in our undergraduate and graduate programs, moving from teaching to learning, these internships, in-service learning, digital. I know you're developing a learning commons here and so on. That's really important. All of this is so important, I think, is because, let's face it, I think the 21st century could go in many different directions. The World Social Science Forum in 2009 emphasized this in terms of one planet worlds apart. We're going to be hosting here in Canada the next version of this in Montreal in October 2013. I invite you to. And it really suggests our potential for helping with some of the great problems around the world in terms of gaps between rich and poor and climate change and all the competing priorities and challenges that we're facing around the world, and how much we have to contribute to all that. Obviously, we have lots to contribute as well in terms of some of the downsides of the digital age and new technologies and so on. And I think we have a lot to contribute in terms of making this turn out right. Should we be optimistic about this? Well, my argument is that I think it's, not that long ago, a little over a century ago, we were still thinking about the weather in terms of the Farmer's Almanac. Well, we got serious about that, and I think today, we didn't know it was going to be this beautiful, but we were pretty sure that when Ted and I were driving down that the weather would be more or less like that. And similarly, we've gotten pretty good in terms of colliding particles and so on. We've learned many, many things thanks to really taking that seriously. And I think you think about how recently we've really taken serious behavioral change, how we can change behavior and so on. And my sense, at least, is that it's really recently. Northrop Frye has a way of thinking about this, and in his volume, The Educated Imagination, he makes the point, in fact, that really what we want to do, I think, is we have to develop a vision of the society we want to live in. And my sense is that we're slowly getting there with a new focus on human thought and behavior and how we can build an integrated world that's people-centered and does justice to human dignity. Grand merci à tous et toutes, and I just love to hear what you think about all this. So over to you. Thank you.